Okay, so I read a quote recently that said, the body speaks a language. It's called direct experience.
Mm.
Please welcome Angelika Alana. You're the founder of the Somatic Healing Institute. And that quote, it was actually a quote we're putting quotes together for social media from my first book. And that quote, I was like, I swear to God, I did not say that. I don't remember writing that. It's hitting me like it's hitting me for the first time. And it reminds me so much of your work, the body-based healing.
Mm. It's beautiful when you're in that space, I think, of channeling, right? And you write something or something comes through you and it feels like it surprises even you. And I think, or you read it back and it informs you or gives you what you need. And I think that's like a beautiful representation of alignment and what happens when we get out the way. And I think that the reason I love body-based healing so much is that it gives us access to the unconscious mind where so much of what's getting in the way lives.
Right. So what kind of work do you do specifically at the Somatic Healing Institute with body-based healing? Like, there's a lot of things in body-based healing, right? There's yoga. Some people even say handwriting, journaling is somatic. There's my partner Saw's project, his work, the somatic activated healing method, dance, all the different pranayama, breath work, all these things, plant medicine. Where does your work center?
Yeah, it started, I mean, speaking of yoga, I started as a yoga teacher. I started practicing yoga at 15 and then teaching at 20. And then that kind of moved naturally into coaching. And I think that I've always been drawn to body based methods because I've always been pretty open in these sort of upper chakras, and I needed help being in this body and grounding and existing and direct experience and all the things you kind of described. And so I guess my own personal journey led me to be so passionate. And I just found that for me, it's what works. And then as far as what we do at the Somatic Healing Institute, it ranges. I train other coaches and facilitators in my method, which is the somatic psychospiritual approach to coaching, or spa, which I joke is kind of fun because we all want to go to the spa, but essentially, the work is based both around traditional somatic style coaching, which is about like hearing the body talk and getting into a space of the unconscious mind through tapping into sensations, memories, associations. We know the science shows us that our unconscious mind, or the parts of our brain that often hold the deepest stored trauma or obstacles to what it is we want in life, are not held in the rational mind, the speaking mind, the logical mind. So, in order to get to those deeper access places, we need to move through things like sensation, emotion, uh, images, memories. So you kind of navigate that space in a particular way with this method. But essentially, what we're saying is that we're using the body and its sensations as the doorway to the unconscious mind. We're letting it lead us and speak to us. Your soma, your there's an intelligence within you, to your unconscious mind, to your body. Like if we think about it, our body, we're not trying to make our heart beat. We're not trying to store memories. We're not trying to create associations. And even oftentimes, we're not trying to enact behavior. So there's so much intelligence that in our day-to-day life we don't have a lot of access to. So that's one part of it. And the other part for me that's been hugely impactful is pleasure, and using sexual energy, pleasure energy as a way to reintegrate difficult experiences, as a way to reassociate with different parts of ourselves, as a way to embody self-love. A lot of times I'll have clients or community members say through like ritual of pleasure and self-massage that they're like, oh, I actually got it. For a moment, I really felt like I love this body and I love this being and I love me, not just like a mental concept, but an actually embodied experience. And I think That's so important because once you have an embodied experience of that, even though you lose it, which you will, we'll forget, you'll have a reference point. It's not just like some concept of self love. You're like, no, I know what it feels like to love this body, this life, this being as I am. And so, therefore, I know that I can move back toward that space. It's really hard when we don't have a reference point. So, that's a little.
Right. Oh yeah, that's super interesting. I mean, it makes perfect sense. Like we need some kind of context to work with. And when we experience something that's traumatic, or our body can't process it, or our mind can't process it, we have that traumatic imprint in the nervous system, in the cellular and muscular memory. Those feelings, they find their anchor point, they lodge themselves in there. And having what I love about your approach is the psycho-spiritual approach to it. It's there's that piece of being able to have like a mental relationship and narrative to the process. When it comes to sex, we have so much energy on it. Why? Because sex is the bomb. Sex is it's everyone's favorite thing. Sex is, of course, it's the creative power of the universe. It's sex is the power to create life. Sex, the orgasm, it has like this whole effect on the neurochemistry, the nervous system. All of the different organs of the body have their own like relationship. Like the heart rate increases, the brain stops fucking working. There's like all different kinds of increased sensitivity that happens in different parts of the body, everything during sexual activity. And so of course a specific imprint comes in, especially if you have like a sexual trauma. There's an imprint that's pervasive throughout the entire system that's related to that traumatic event. And so now you have to do almost like physical therapy. That's a way to look at it. The somatic work is like a physical therapy that you integrate into the body. So you have your pleasure practices, as well as other things. It's not like my understanding of your work and what I've read and explored is that it's holistic. So you're not saying, okay, so just masturbate and that challenge is going to go away. Just masturbate. In some ways it's
Wouldn't
kind
that be nice though?
of,
If it could be that easy.
yeah, if only, right? If only it
Mm.
could be that easy. It is interesting that when we think about a divine source and a creative intelligence, it makes perfect sense that you should be able to pleasure yourself, like the physical ability to create one's own orgasm, not needing another person for that.
Mm.
It means that there's something more to it than the actual biological procreation, which is the traditional modern Christian perspective on like monogamy and
Yes.
masturbation and those kinds of things that have been stigmatized.
Yeah, and I think like on that kind of all of the stigma and the shame, like the greatest dragons often guard the biggest treasure. And I think that's why we have so much shadow in the things around money and sex, medicine work, all of these areas that have potential to create such powerful, potent, positive transformation also have so much shadow, is latent with so much shadow and layers of unconsciousness. And that's also why there's such ripe opportunity for transformation, because it takes so much psychic energy to hold all of that shame in place in our bodies. And so,
Damn. Okay, pause. I'm sorry. I have to just like that hit. I have to let it land. Okay. Like as you said that about this, about how it takes so much psychic energy to hold on to that shame, all these layers of energy within my own subtle body were like, pa, pa, pa.
mm,
And I just realized, even though I'm in this work, and I'm a meditator, and I've got therapy, and I've got a partner who like really holds me accountable for everything, and I've got a community that holds me accountable in different ways, and I have my practices and all of that stuff. I still notice just now, I consider myself a relatively healthy person. I I experienced just now when you said it, how much psychic weight I was holding after all these years, after coming out to my family, after having therapy about coming out to my family, and all of the different things that happened, after working with the medicine to clear all kinds of sexual trauma, all kinds of traumatic experiences as a child, all kinds of religious trauma, physical abuse, verbal abuse, bouts with, brushes up against addictive spaces, recovery from that deep grief, experiencing homicide and suicide, within immediate relationships, all kinds of traumas. And so much of that, I've had to let go of so much shame. And it's literally like, okay, whatever. If you can't handle me, look, someone's got to care about me, and it's got to be me. I've gone through this whole shift where I've released so much shame from all of that, going from full blown, I hate myself, I should kill myself, what's wrong with me, blah, 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 internalized far right homophobia, violence against myself. I've gone from healing from so much of that there's a part of me that sometimes thinks it's all gone and that work is done, but it's clearly not, because when you were just talking, when you just said that, I could feel the shame. And it's like, when I look at it with my inner eye right now, I see that psychic weight, this burden that's literally keeping me back from holding more, from my capacity for other things. When something has psychic weight and you're holding psychic weight, you literally only can carry so much. You can't even
Yes.
pick up on whatever's going on, no matter how sensitive you are, no matter how intuitive you are, no matter how intelligent you are. You only have so much weight you can carry. The biggest bodybuilders in the world can only carry so much weight. Even if they can carry more than anyone else in the world, they're still at risk for injury if there's too much weight.
Yes. And you bring up a good point around holding more. Like, firstly, thank you for sharing. I think everyone listening can resonate with the feeling of particularly sexual shame. I mean, it starts so early. We wonder, like, why do children know to hide when they self-pleasure or they're exploring their bodies, or like how do they know that it's bad or wrong or dirty? Not that it is, but they've inherited that belief. It's like because we're imprinting them every time they feel our shame and our contraction. It's a legacy that just keeps getting passed down and down and down. And we're all carrying these imprints around. As you say, it's so heavy a load, and it's largely unconscious. It's like we're walking up the mountain with this 50-kilo backpack on, and we don't even know it's on. We don't even know what it feels like to put it down. And pleasure practices can help us actually get a breath of what it feels like to just put a little of that down and go, wow, oh my gosh, I didn't even know I was carrying that. And you brought up this idea of holding more, and that has been something that's been so transformative for me, to recognize that my capacity to allow myself to feel good, and I'm talking about pleasure not just in direct genital stimulation. That's part of it for sure. We learn to work with that very powerful energy. It's a wonderful energy to work with, but it's about pleasure as a whole, like the whole body coming alive. I once had a teacher say to me, when you really get Tantra and you really get into the practices, the whole body can become a clitoris. So the whole body can become, very, very erotically sensitive, as if it were direct genital stimulation. So, and I think what she's talking about is our capacity to resensitize, to get back into feeling our body as a vessel for goodness. And, so many of the inherent wisdom in the mystic traditions is talking about our essential nature is bliss. And it's not that grasping, hungry ghost energy. And I think that's why sex is so interesting and pleasure is so interesting, because it's so easy for us to switch off and just go to that like reaching, grasping place, versus switching, like turning on and tuning in and being like, whether I'm rubbing my sternum or the tip of my nose, like, Can I be actually present to the sensation here? And it teaches us about need fulfillment. Like, does that actually feel good to me? And can I touch myself in a way, whether it's the tip of my nose or massaging my face? Can I actually give myself loving, supportive, nourishing touch? Can I actually delineate, like, what do I need in this moment? And can I give myself that, which is hugely transformative. We think we're just touching our body. It's like, no, there's something happening here. There's a re-imprinting happening. And when we learn how to allow our nervous system to hold more pleasure and goodness in life, what happens is we stop sabotaging, because we each have these upper limits of intimacy and connection and joy. Like, we're getting too close, I'm going to start a fight with my partner. There's too much intimacy happening. I'm going to, somehow create a rupture. Or too much pleasure, I'm going to shut myself off from orgasm. Or I'm about to get a raise, I'm going to start slacking off. And like, too much goodness, and our nervous system's registering it as a threat, because maybe somewhere along the way we were running naked through the sprinkler in total glee, and our parent came out and said, put some clothes on, we have neighbors. And you go, oh my gosh, it's not safe for me to relax into my joy. That's somehow going to threaten me, threaten my ability to be loved, threaten my attachment. And as Gabor Mate says, children will choose their attachment over their authentic feelings, needs, and desires every time. And over time, we learn to continually do that. And so reconnecting with the body and our sensations and what's alive inside of us, whether it's through somatic work or self-touch or these types of body-based healings, that's actually a reconnection to our authentic self. Who was I before the world taught me who I had to be in order to maintain my love and attachment? And that's that painful shame that's so heavy to carry. That's that gap between who we are at our core, our original essence, and who we've been programmed to be. And it's not that we're never going to have programming. It's just like, can those two things be coherent? Can our essential self and our social self at least work together? Because we're all going to have an ego, we're all going to have programming. Or is the gap between those two things so vast? The gap between, like, having to hide, as you were saying, like having to hide who you are. I imagine, like, each of us do that in our own ways. You spoke about coming out and the pain of doing that, and probably the difficulty, but the pain of not doing it, right? I imagine became so great, that gap between who you had to be or thought you had to be to maintain love versus who you are, your essential being. That gap for many of us gets so vast and so fucking painful. And that's life saying, like, how much load, how much psychic weight are you going to take on to be who you think you need to be to maintain love and attachment in this world?
It's so crucial to, like, explore the unconscious, because we a lot of times the story in our mind is not the story that's actually playing out objectively.
Yes.
We have a story of what's happening in that relationship and why that fight happened and why this really bothered me and why they should have done this or that, or why they shouldn't have done this or that. And so often what you're looking at is actually an archetype, something that's playing out, that plays out that way, almost like a law of nature. It's like these circumstances create these circumstances. And
Yes.
you referred to a couple different Buddhist things over the last couple minutes. In Buddhism, karma, we have very specific causes and conditions for very specific causes and conditions. Certain things. One thing that I learned recently when I was on the recent trip that you know about in Kathmandu at the Kopan Monastery with Lama Zopa Rinpoche, we were studying the Lam Rim, which is the graduated path to enlightenment. And one of the teachings is on karma, and specifically on the specific results of certain kinds of karmic activities. One thing that I thought was really interesting, for an example, is they'll say this specific kind of action yields this specific kind of karmic response. And it's like an equation. And you look at it and it's actually true. It's objectively true. It's universally true. You have an immediate, well, that makes perfect sense. Some of it is like, okay, that's kind of interesting. I see the potential for a stretch there. I see, but some of it enters into a space where it's not more immediately known. Like one of the interesting ones was sexual misconduct results in not having good sense organs in a future life. So
Ooh.
that one's kind of hard to really be like, I see exactly how that plays out, that one. But when it comes to some of the other karmas of sexual misconduct, it's very hard for you to stay committed to anything. It's very hard for you to maintain friendships and relationships, and even professional relationships.
Well, we see that in this lifetime, right? You have to
And we
wait
see
a whole
that one.
lifetime.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
see that one now, and it makes perfect sense because the way I relate to someone is the way I relate to people.
Hmm.
And so with sexual misconduct, it's really referring to um, unethical behavior outside of the context of monogamy. That's usually uh, the idea. Many alternate perspectives on it, like some things that you teach that I think are really interesting, that are perfectly compatible with this exact idea in Buddhism, is the idea of consensual non-monogamy. And that
Mm.
would consensual behavior within consensual non-monogamy would not be considered sexual misconduct from a karmic perspective.
Mm. Yeah, I think consent is such a important topic that we're not taught about enough. So a lot of us don't really fully understand consent. I also think a lot of consent, is about attunement, and especially when we're in those energetic and sexual spaces. Of course, until you are fully attuned, and when we're teaching young people, you want to be teaching them how to get consent at every step. If you're about to take another step that's a step further than wherever you are, always saying, is this okay? And I think as we get older and more intimate with a partner, we might be able to attune to their subtle signs and sounds, and their body. And I think the reason that that's so hard is so much of us lack attunement to our own bodies and our own sounds and our own needs and our own desires. And because of that kind of developmental trauma I was speaking of earlier, where we thought that what I need and desire threatens my ability to be loved and safe, we learn to disconnect from our needs and desires. And if we're disconnected from our needs and desires, they don't go anywhere. We just drive them into our unconscious mind, where they rule us more. They might come out as sexual misconduct. They might come out as collapsing in, lashing out, but all sorts of unconscious ways we play those needs out, instead of having a conscious relationship to what we need and desire, which allows us to express that and then give and get consent. But if we don't know or aren't in contact with our feelings and our needs and our desires, then that's the most important thing we need to do in order to be able to relate, whether it's sexually, intimately, however, in any relationship, in a healthy way. I believe so much of the dysfunction I see is around actually not having a healthy, integrated connection to our needs and desires, such that we can express them. And consensual, I always joke, like, consensual non-monogamy is kind of like the relationship Olympics, because it's an added level of complexity. So it's going to require an extended level of relational skills and presence and consciousness. And because it brings up a lot, relationships already bring up a lot of content. So you want to add more complexity that makes. And I think the consensual part just means that all parties are aware of and are consenting to whatever is happening within the container of your agreements. And I think what we're seeing now in this kind of like psychedelic revolution, there's a bit of a like monogamy, consensual non-monogamy, like breaking apart of that construct as well. We're seeing a lot of reinvention. There's a long way to go in so many of our systems, of course, but we are seeing movement. And I think that points to this desire for people to have more of their needs met openly, because so much of our, clearly monogamy, there's challenges to that. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a 50% divorce rate. So it's not
Right.
necessarily that monogamy is wrong or bad. I don't think so. I think pair bonding is beautiful. I think it can work really well, but I don't think it works for everyone. And so what most people do is they either just do like move on to the next person. They get to the hard part in the relationship and they can't make it work. So they're like, I'm just going to move on to the next person, which isn't it's like Esther Perel says, monogamy used to mean one person for life. Now it means just one person at a time. And then we also have to look at the rates of infidelity. So a lot of people are practicing non-monogamy, just not consensually. And so I think that people are desiring to build their own relationship containers. That's what I see in the couples and the individuals that I work with, is that they just kind of want to know, like, what are the options on the table? And a lot of times, like, they might not even necessarily feel ready to explore that, but they just kind of want to have some narrative outside of the very strict and rigid heteronormative, like monogamous normative narrative, cisgendered normative narrative that's portrayed around, this is what love is, this is how it goes, and if you can't fit within this, then there's something wrong with you.
Mm-hmm.
And pathologizing people, which is very hard, when usually, well, we know that doesn't mean that someone's broken. It's like if you put a plant in a dark room without water and it doesn't grow, and you're like, well, that's the plant's fault. It's like, no, we need to create the conditions right for each individual within which they can, like, bloom.
I mean, absolutely. There's so many things that we just adopt from previous generations. And I remember a story someone told me where they were making a pork roast, and they took it out. They cut the two ends off. They put it in the pan. They put it in the oven. They bake it. That's how mom always did it. I'm doing it that way. Mom's over one day. Mom's elderly. Mom's a grandma now. I'm now making pot roast just like how she made it. I'm cutting the ends off and putting it in the oven. We're eating it. It's perfect. She loves it. Everything's great. She asks me why I cut the ends off. And I said, well, because you always cut the ends off. I thought we just cut the ends off. And she was like, no, I did that because it didn't fit in the pan we had. So there are some traditions. That's not my story. That's like a story I heard. There are some traditions that we're adopting, and we're forgetting the original utility of that purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And now we are evolving. There's this big concept in religion. It's especially common in the Abrahamic traditions, the Judeo-Christian Islamic traditions, where we hear this idea that God never changes. God never ever changes, and so that is one of the areas where we get really sticky in our thinking, because we're paying attention to the wrong part of what's happening. We never needed to cut the two ends off of the pot roast. Mom only did that so it could fit in the pan. We don't have to do everything exactly how they did it, even if they thought that we would need to do it that way.
Yes.
They don't even understand their own unconscious minds. So we have to try to also understand what was going on contextually. What were the causes and conditions for these things to arise? When did they arise? What was the cauldron they were brewing in, consciously and unconsciously? What were the things that these people were afraid of? What were they focusing on? What were their needs and priorities? And we're in a world that's nothing like the world in any
Yes.
way
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
created.
Sorry, go for it.
Tell me about the agricultural revolution. Go, get it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure people listening have heard that that's when kind of marriage and monogamy really settled in, is when we had land ownership and we started being static and farming, and instead of being nomadic, and we needed to, therefore, once we had ownership, transfer ownership. And that meant we needed to understand paternity in a way that we didn't previously have. And so it was kind of born of that necessity of, I need to know that this is my child, because that's why I want to pass this land to my kid, whereas that wasn't a necessity prior to that. And I think it's like not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. There are some beautiful things to monogamy. It does work for some people. And I think what's interesting is when this discussion opens up, a lot of people listening can feel like it's a runaway train that they don't want to get on board. And I think it's really important, if people are feeling triggered, to know that other people's sexual or relational choices do not threaten yours.
Right.
And that's like important when we think about like homophobia, transphobia, like other people's choices with their body, with their sexuality, with how they relate, in no way threaten how you want to use or engage with your body and your relationships. We have to remember that when we're talking about these types of things, because it can feel very like, oh no, if everyone starts doing that, like then there'll be no mates left for me that only want to do monogamy. And if that's just not true, there's always going to be plenty of people, especially how connected we are now with the internet. You can find all sorts of people that are into all sorts of niche things. So if monogamy becomes niche, which I don't think it will, then don't worry, loves, you're going to be all good. But yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. Like, what are we optimizing for? And the beautiful thing is we now get to ask that for ourselves. Like, when you have a new partner, or partners, or whatever configuration you're working in, just being like, what are we optimizing for? What am I optimizing for? It's like, one of my friends, Dr. Kat Meyer, once said, it's like a Build-A-Bear, your relationship. You just get to build it how you want it, and how you want it. So it's like, if you want monogamy built in and that's important to you, it's just meaning, I think the invitation now is to like actually explore and inquire, which of these beliefs have I inherited, and which of them, like, why do I cut the ends off the pork? Like, is that true for me? And if it is, amazing. But like, for a lot of people, it's not. And, I had a friend ask me once, like, is it that you don't want that? Or is it that you believe you can't have it? And I was like, ooh, interesting question. And for a lot of people, they're going to prioritize relational safety and connection, intimacy. They want that more. And so if they believe they can't have other desires that they have, perhaps like novelty, sexual exploration, maybe they have certain kinks that their nesting partner does not have, like, they just think, well, I just sacrifice that because I can't have both. And
Right.
we know in conscious communication that sometimes there's an option C. How can we creatively and compassionately get everybody's needs met? It's like game theory in relationships. I don't know if you've heard of, I hope I don't butcher his name, but Daniel Schmachtenberg. He talks about game theory, which is this idea that right now as a species we're playing game A, which is a win-lose game. Every time I win, someone else loses. And if we look at this through the lens of romantic partnerships, I see this in my my virtual office again and again and again, that partners come in, or an individual comes in and they're struggling in their relationship because they feel that if their partner gets their needs met, then they will lose, or if they get their needs met, then their partner will lose, and they're stuck in this gridlock power struggle of one of us has to lose, and that creates a really unhealthy push-pull power struggle dynamic, and it's really difficult to exist in. Actually, it's very draining having to guard your needs and desires all the time and push and pull and push and pull. And so game theory is this idea that game A is that win-lose, and that we're not only doing that in romantic relationships. Look at our systems. Look at all the systems that we've built throughout, whether it's our financial systems, our food and agricultural systems, our energy systems. They're all built on this win-lose model. Somewhere, someone else is losing when person A wins. And what he talks about is that's a problem, that fundamentally on a consciousness level, we need to start moving to game B, which is shifting the incentives of the game altogether to keep going from one person or team has to win, to the aim of the game being to keep as many players in the game for as long as possible.
Right.
And that's a big shift in consciousness. That would require us to create a shift in how we incentivize all of our systems on a big systems thinking level. But if we shrink that down into relationships, it comes down to that conscious question of, okay, is there an option C? I ask my clients that question all the time to get them out of that gridlock thinking. What's option C? Because they're only looking at option A and B.
I think this is so crucial to literally even, I mean, for me, I'm happy to be having this discussion. I know some people are going to be triggered by parts of this. I want to even just take the monogamy and the big scary ones out. I just want to look at little disagreements.
Yes.
Little riffs, little fights right here with exactly what you're saying. Is there an option C?
Yes.
It requires a certain amount of self-reflection where you say, okay, so I do need to feel like in my space, it's my space and I'm fully in refuge here. I need to feel that way in my space. And so I have these control patterns, and maybe that fed into my control pattern, and so, but then I also can feel free to say to my partner, I get that that's basically me not being perfect, but also could you be down with honoring that in my space, I need to feel like I'm totally at refuge. And
Mm,
what else is going on here, I'm going to be like considered top priority when I'm
mm.
here in this place that's my refuge, even though that means I'm not a perfectly enlightened Buddha. Um,
Yeah.
you know,
I think it's drilling down because what we often confuse, we confuse needs with strategies for getting those needs met. And that's where we have Clash of the Titans because we're like, this is a need and we're expressing it, but what we're actually expressing is a strategy for getting the need met. And that's when things become rigid and we're not in creativity because it's like there is a win lose. It's like, this is my need. I need you to come home. Let's use an example. And I need the house to be totally spotless. And you have an idea of what that means. And so that's my need. And no, that's a strategy for getting a need met. Because then your partner's going to say, let's say, and in this example, a partner's going to come home and say, well, I need to feel like I can come home and take a load off and not have to immediately start more work at home. And they're going to say, well, that's my need. And now you can see how those two needs can't occupy the same space at the same time. But
right.
those aren't needs, those are
Because,
strategies.
oh my God, you're blowing my mind. Thank you for this. Okay, so talk to me about the difference between the needs we have and the things that we think are needs, which are actually strategies for meeting those needs.
Yeah, so needs are actually really universal for all of us. They're not that creative, which is good because that's where the place that we can come home to and relate and say, okay, no matter how different we may appear, no matter how different our way of expressing in the world and expressing our values, we're actually fundamentally, we need the same things as human beings. We need safety, love, acceptance, belonging, sense of trust, feeling significant. When I speak, people listen. You know, what I do matters. There's a level of significance. These like fundamental core basic needs. And so, what we want to do when we feel ourselves stuck in this gridlock is like, can I regulate my nervous system enough, do what I need to do, such that I can loosen the grip on this strategy and come to find what is underneath it? Let's say the house has to be spotless when our partner gets home. What does that represent to me? It's like that represents maybe it's peace, maybe it's safety. Maybe we grew up in a really chaotic home environment. And so we've learned to manage that that like fear of chaos and that instability that we experienced as a little one through making our home spotless, and that makes us feel safe. You know, we don't know, and given the context of our life and our experiences, but when we drill down, then it's much easier for us to actually express that from a vulnerable place, like, hey, when the house is clean, I feel safe because I recognize I grew up in a really chaotic, messy, unsafe environment, and this represents safety to me. And you know, the partner B can say, okay, well, when I get home and I feel like I can just take my shoes off and take a shower and just, you know, do what I need to do, I feel respected. I feel like the energy that I'm putting in at work is being seen. I feel like you're understanding the amount of work I'm doing, that I'm being valued. And so now we can have a real vulnerable conversation because now we can see, I see how that makes you feel safe and why that's important to you. Okay, I see how your need is to be respected and valued. Okay, how can we creatively and compassionately get both of these needs met? Respect, value, safety. It doesn't have to look like taking the shoes off and showering right away. It doesn't have to look like a spotless house. It might, but now that we understand the fundamental universal need underneath, now we can get creative and actually loosen the grip on the power struggle of win-lose and put our heads together and say, okay, these needs aren't that unique.
Right.
You know, there
And
is a way through.
what's so amazing about what you're talking about, thank you so much for this. This is such good shit. I'm like, oh, thank you. I'm gonna listen to this one again and like journal about how I can apply this. Like I feel so grateful for it. So what I think is so interesting is looking at our you know our situation where we're in, you know, the situation that you're thinking of when you're listening to this, the situation that's resonating where you're like, oh, that's kind of like me in this way, in this relationship, or maybe in this one, or maybe you're thinking of another person and their behavior or whatever, whatever that situation is. If we call that into our mind right now, when we look at our own lives and we find an area where we feel like a need isn't being met, look at the need real quick. Okay, is that a need or is it a strategy for the need to be met? When you're in a situation and you really have that realization, in Buddhism, we a lot of times we call it in an analytical meditation, will really look at it. And the idea is to really cultivate the actual inner realization of the higher truth. Wow,
Mm.
I'm making the unconscious thing that I thought was a need, which is actually an unconscious strategy for a need. I'm making that now conscious and realizing the actual need, which is a layer deeper in. And now that I know that that's my need, okay, wow, I'm a human being in process. I guess it's true. I guess I'm not a perfectly enlightened Buddha. After all, you take that moment, you realize it, you accept yourself, you accept that you're in process and that it's okay and that you're still amazing and you're still killing it and it's still the bomb to be you. And we're still so grateful for you. But you take that in, you realize it, and then you hold that same grace for another person. Full
Mhm.
acceptance. We love you so much. I still love this other person so much. Still so stoked that you're here. Still so stoked that you're alive and that you exist in this universe. Hey, you're not a fully enlightened Buddha. Cat's out of the bag. Sorry, but you are human. No big deal. So grateful for you. Love that for you. Love that you're human, and fully accept that part is a strategy, and there is this deeper need that this soul needs, that this other person who's really here with a beating heart really needs. And then you
Mhm.
have that realization, have it now, think about that person, right? And open your heart into that possibility that
Mhm.
there's something deeper there. And what changes is that you feel, on the day that you come home and you feel good and you feel like you've had a healthy day, maybe you have some energy to tidy up the house. They love that. And hey, you don't
Mhm.
mind it when it's tidy. You've got some extra energy, no big deal right now, got some time, whatever. It becomes easier to fill those other like aesthetic needs. Like
Mhm.
there's like a sort of more of a superficial need that may actually be a strategy to get a core need met, but we still
Mhm.
like them. Even if you're
Yeah.
even if you're being present and you're like, you know what, the cleanliness of my house does not define who I am. Even if you're totally enlightened,
Yes.
it's still like actually nice to have a clean house.
Yes. Yes. And here's a really important point is that it doesn't mean that you won't get your requests met. It just means you'll be more conscious of where they're actually coming from, which will have you loosen the grip a little and be more of a team player rather than a win-lose. Like, I need this as it is. The request may not be moved versus this is the best way I know how to get this need met, but I'm open to hearing if you think we can find another way to get all of our needs met. And that might be some give and take. There might be some shift. There's just a spaciousness for allowing an adjustment to the strategy versus a rigid. We're believing that core need is the strategy, and we're miss sort of associating and over identifying with the strategy. It's not that the strategy isn't a good one or that we don't want to have a clean home or we have to disconnect from that need. And I think that's also an important thing to bring up. Most of us are stuck in the unconscious need cycle that we have as children. When we're children, if a need doesn't get met, we haven't learnt yet how to express what the need is and make requests. So we go into protest, some kind of protest behavior. We act out or we act in, we move into protest. If that doesn't work, we move into anger. If that doesn't work, we move into outrage or rage, maybe even a tantrum. And if that doesn't work and our need is still not met, we will disconnect from ourselves, our bodies, and our needs. Right. And so many of us are still stuck in that cycle as adults. We have a need, we don't really fully know what it is, we don't feel like we fully have the right to express it, whatever our distorted relationship with our needs is and how that manifests. We might be
Mhm.
passive about it, we might not even know we have it, but we feel this frustration, we move into protest behavior, we act out, we act in, we withdraw our love, we become passive, we become aggressive, whatever it is. Then that doesn't work and we move into more aggressive behaviors, acting out and acting in. If that doesn't work, then we disconnect. If we're spiritual, which I think a lot of your listeners might be, one of the main ways to disconnect is to say, I'm just going to love deeper. I'm just going to love wider. I'm just going to need less. What we're actually doing in that moment is saying, I'm going to protect my attachment relationship over my authentic needs because I don't know how to get my needs met. Now, the conscious relationship to need cycle that we want to move into, when that's happening, we know we're in child consciousness. That's what we do when we're little, when our needs don't get met. And we can have a lot of compassion for that because most of us didn't get taught this stuff, nor did we get modeled this stuff. But that's the kid that thinks, I'm not going to be okay if this person doesn't meet my needs. That's not true anymore for us. We're adults now, right? We can choose. Kids can't. We can. So the conscious need fulfillment cycle is, okay, I recognize I have a need. Let me sit with that. What's coming up for me? Okay, emotions. What are those emotions? How am I experiencing in my body? And what do they tell me that I therefore value? What's important to me here? What do I need? Okay, what's my strategy for getting that need met? Okay, and what's the core need underneath that? Now I can come to someone with a really clear request. Here's what I'm experiencing. When you do X in situation Y, I feel Z. And now time for the request. You can put it forward, and then it's a request and not a demand. They may choose to not meet you there. They may choose that they can't for whatever reason. They may not have the capacity. They may say they're going to and then continually not. And now, as an adult, we are faced with a choice. The conscious relationship to needs is, am I going to let this go, knowing that this person has continually demonstrated to me that they are unable to meet this need? And therefore, I have a choice. Am I willing to be in relationship with this person anyway, knowing that they cannot meet this need? And I will not withhold meeting this need for myself. I'm not going to wait for them to give it to me. I'm going to give it to myself either way. Or are they showing me that they can't meet this need? And that is a deal breaker for me. That means that I cannot be in healthy relationship and connection with them. And I therefore need to walk away or change the agreement of this relationship. And again, the thing that's constant, I will meet the need for myself anyway. Whether they show up on the middle of the bridge or not, the little boy and little girl inside of each of us, a little gender neutral being, needs to know that we will be there, because that's what they didn't get when we were kids. No one came. No one was
Right.
coming. We are.
Right.
No matter what, whether your partner does or doesn't, whether your partners do or don't meet your needs, you will continue. The conscious relationship is, I'm going to make the request. I'm going to be fully aware of it. They may meet it. They may need some support in meeting it. But if they don't, I'm not going to wait to give it to myself, and I'm going to make the adult choice of, what does this mean? Like, be honest. They're not meeting my need, and it's clear to me they're not going to. So let's operate under the truth of that. And what does that actually mean for me? Am I going to continue to be resentful and wind around and around and around this unconscious need fulfillment cycle? Or am I going to make a choice to either A, okay, they're not going to meet it and I can still be with them, or I can't.
Right. Wow. Yeah, that's so adult. That's so mature. That's so thorough. It's like we think about the wisest, most mature people we know, and then we think about them in relationships. And they're not good in relationships. I'm sorry, like very few of them are. It's a like, no offense to the elders, but that's an area where we haven't cracked the code as a species. And not even to mention the way oppressive legislation is still rampant worldwide. So there is like an entire collective issue of looking at our collective unconscious. And so I think it's really important that you're doing the work that you're doing. I'm so grateful for it. I think it's so intelligent and thorough and just right. You really hit the sweet spot for me by having thorough, intellectually satisfying perspectives. You hold a lot of space for the sensitivity of the issues that you're navigating, and you present it all with a very hopeful, broad, open, flexible, really context instead of tools to navigate within. I think you also develop a language. You've created a lot of new pathways through the way that you discuss these different things and the words that you use. So thank you for your work in the universe. Thank you for this. Thank you for being an angel.
Oh, those words are landing on my heart. Thank you so much, brother. It's so good to be here with you. And yeah, just to get to brain dance and heart dance and soul dance.
Yeah. So let's do it again soon.
Yes, more soon.
Take care.